muted, but yeah, you're fine. Go ahead.
Okay. I was really scared. All right. So, yes, Duluth, it's an amazing place to be. And what I want to do in the course of this presentation today is kind of introduce you to the migration that's happening here, a little bit about Hawk Ridge, and a lot about some of the things that we're doing, research and activity-wise, and who we are, and most importantly of all, the storyline for some of these amazing birds. So here we go. There you are. You're virtually at Hawk Ridge, looking out over the lake, and it's a phenomenal view on a day. And here is a bald eagle gracing us with its presence. Yeah, it's a great place to be. It's an overlook with lots of absolutely. I always say to people, it's an awesome place to hang out, even if no birds are flying at all. So here you go. In Minnesota, according to the DNR and the Minnesota Ornithological Union, you can see approximately 444 species of different kinds of birds during any given year, but only 56 of those can be said to be living here year-round. The rest of them are migrators, and Duluth is Migration Central. So welcome to Migration Central. And if you weren't convinced by all of that, let me take you to eBird, one of our wonderful birding apps. And if you go into eBird and you go into Minnesota and look for places to do, you can check out county lists. And St. Louis County, where Duluth is located, always ranks top of the list. So it's an amazing place with lots of stuff going on. Here's a teaser of some of the birds, and each one of them have amazing and incredible stories. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background first about Hawk Ridge as an organization. Our mission, as is stated on the slide, is to protect all the birds and other migratory birds as they're going through the Western Lake Superior region. And this is all done through education and research and taking care of the property that we're stewards of. Here's a better look. If you've not been to Hawk Ridge, it's on the eastern edge of Duluth and up on what we call East Skyline Parkway. So it gives us a great view of what's going on of the lake and the whole area. Historically, it's no accident that Hawk Ridge is known as a place for migration. A long time ago in the 20s and 30s, Hawk Ridge was once known as a place where birds were shot for target practice. But in the late 30s, a group of enlightened folks, the members of the Duluth Bird Club, which later became the Duluth Audubon Society, reported that people were shooting birds, and they could literally go and collect bushel baskets of dead hawks up there because it was such a phenomenal place for birds migrating by. We didn't have a very good understanding of the ecology of the system, and that a healthy system needs its predators at that point in time. And it probably would have continued that way indefinitely until something happened. And the something that happened for Hawk Ridge was the advent of the first ornithology professor at the University of Minnesota Duluth. His name was Jack Hofsland. And he immediately hooked up with Hawk Ridge as a place that he knew needed preservation. He also knew that he needed to change the mindset of folks about what they thought about the area. He, the story goes, would come each day during a migration season with a sign that says, "Please don't shoot the birds," on cardboard, and he'd put it in a prominent location around the area, and then he'd leave, and he'd come back in the end of the day, and they'd all be off in the woods somewhere, and he'd put a new sign. And he persistently did that and actually got other people involved in starting to track with that, which, like I say, became the Duluth Bird Club. And the Duluth Bird Club eventually was able to get the city of Duluth to change the ordinance and allow to prohibit shooting of birds in city limits. And so that stopped it, and things began in 1951 to 1971. There was a kind of erratic sort of beginning of the research of birds at Hawk Ridge. And then eventually, in the beginning in 1972, we started a serious, consistent effort of hawk watching and raptor banding. Began in 1972. 2004, the Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory was officially established, in addition to the Hawk Ridge Nature Reserve, and was named as the first important bird area in Minnesota. And in fall of 2021, that'll be our 50th year of counting, banding, studying, protecting, and educating about the birds of the area. So pretty amazing process. So why is it such an amazing place? Well, if you look at this map of the boreal forest, most of the birds that come through this area in migration are birds coming from the boreal forest. And what's so attractive about the boreal forest? Well, it's huge. It stretches across the entire continent, from pretty much coast to coast, in the US and Canada, or at least the northern part of the US and Canada. And it's a huge, wide open space. And we estimate that 3 billion birds migrate to the boreal forest every spring to breed. And if things go well during breeding season, about 5 million more, or 5 billion more, migrate to Central and South America over winter each fall. But what's the big deal? I mean, thinking about it, I mean, some of us with winter coming on think about the tropics with fond thoughts. Why wouldn't you just hang in the tropics and not put yourself at risk every year, twice a year, to make that long trek? Well, it turns out that it's very much tied to productivity. In the north, you can have 24 hours of daylight. In the tropics, they're pretty much locked in at 12 hours of daylight year round and 12 hours of dark. So they don't have that. And that up to 24 hours of daylight increases the plant productivity, which in turn increases the productivity for insects, primary source of nutrition for a lot of the songbirds that come. Just because the tropics have huge diversity does not necessarily correspond to abundance. I remember a few years back, I got the opportunity to go to Costa Rica, and I studied up before I went. And one of the things that I learned is a forest in Costa Rica can have 700 species of trees. And it could be, you find one species of tree, and it could well be a mile before you find another. A lot of these birds are tied to very specific species, and in the tropics, that's a harder gig, plus the competition and the tight space. So apparently it's really advantageous to go north because so many billions of birds do it. Here's an image that shows something that really nerdy birdie nerdies do, and they watch weather radar. You can actually see on weather radar movement of the birds. Each of the black dots on the screen represents a radar station, and if there's a lot of traffic moving, you can actually see it as kind of a round circle of green to blue coloration on your screen. And what this person did was took all of the radar image and combined it all from March the 1st through the 1st of July. And it goes to show you that this central flyway, which we really are the beginning of, is just a phenomenal space for bird migration. It's estimated that 60% or more of the migratory bird species in North America use that central flyway in some way or another. So no great surprise that Duluth and Hawk Ridge should be such an amazing spot, partially just because of location of being right smack in the middle of that central flyway. What do birds use to determine how they migrate? Well, we know it's a combination of looking for big geographical features like huge bodies of water, mountain ridges, and things like that. Birds don't have GPS, and so they use those kinds of things the same way that we do, use road maps and things like that. They will definitely have to take into account weather systems that are occurring. Sometimes they have to go around or through, which is very hazardous. And habitat is a critical issue as the birds are migrating. They need to be able to continue to fuel their system as they fly and be able to arrive alive in to their wintering grounds. At Hawk Ridge, we have these lovely leading lines, and as I mentioned earlier, most of the birds are coming from the boreal forest. And we've learned from our banding efforts that birds in the boreal forest tend to want to stay in habitat as long as they can. And so if you look at the image on the left, you can see the arrows scaling those birds coming from the left, or Western Canada and Alaska, coming on down and staying in the boreal forest as long as they possibly can. We also get birds from the east doing the same thing, and they end up kind of finding themselves at the top of Lake Superior. And you get there, and that big body of water, the largest freshwater lake in the world, is before you. And what are you going to do if you're a bird? You're going to be brave and fly over 170 miles of open water? Well, you could, and some of them actually do, but not very many. For most birds, the idea of 170 miles of no place to land, no available food, and no air currents to aid in the efficiency of your flight is a bad idea. So depending on what's going on with winds and weather, the birds will either cycle themselves around to the east and go visit you folks out there at the Sulaks, or come to the west, which will send them to Duluth. And so birds are hitting Lake Superior at all kinds of places. And if they're funneled to the west, that funnels them right straight through Hawk Ridge in the fall, which is one of the reasons it's an amazing place. So here we go, birds of Duluth and Hawk Ridge. We see just an amazing assortment of birds. And this is a kettle of birds going, and we know that these birds take advantage of this kettling. We always tell visitors that for every mile a soaring bird can go up and get in height, it can gain 7 miles horizontally as far as efficiency of flight. And so the higher up they can get, the better they can do as they go. But we often get asked, how the heck can you count something like that, swirling around and birds going like crazy round and around and around? Well, it turns out that it's really not all that complex a deal. Our counters, who are in charge of counting everything that goes by, just watch those kettles. And basically, I always say it's like riding an elevator. You get to the top. What do you do when you get to the top of the elevator? Well, you get off, and the birds get off by starting to resume their flight to the south. And so the counters can count those birds as they stream off at the top of the kettle. And so that's how they do that. They funnel their way on down. So when does migration begin? Well, depends on the bird species. Some of them, July is the beginning. And typically the birds that leave on the early side of the birds that have to travel the farthest At Hawk Ridge, we began counting all the birds starting August the 15th and continue through the end of November, which is meant to most closely overlap what happens with the raptors, but also the other birds as well. So here we go. Here is our counting platform, and we've got people looking at birds in every direction. And the birds are watched. They'll divide up the areas of the sky and give each counter a specific place. Now, this is a lot of people on the platform. On a given day, we can have 2 to 4 people typically is more likely to be what you're going to see at the platform. So let's just skim through some of the birds that we see in migration, and let's start with the early birds. Here's one of the my favorite early birds, common nighthawks, and one of our graduate students has been doing research on the common nighthawks, and in the course of things has found that truly on the north shore of Lake Superior and in Duluth, we count more common nighthawks coming through than anywhere else in the world. Now, interestingly enough, a bird that's called a nighthawk is neither nocturnal nor is it a hawk. It actually belongs to a group of birds called nightjars. They're related to whippoorwills and common parakeets. If any of you have traveled in the tropics, you might have seen those guys. And these birds are huge insect eaters, and they eat on the fly. You see that tiny little beak? It actually opens to a huge gaping maw of a mouth, and they're very, very good at scooping up aerial insects as they fly. Their typical migration pattern is late August. We say that the peak is usually the last 2 weeks of August, and the flight can be phenomenal. On August the 24th this year, we had an amazing flight of more than 27,000 birds counted through the course of the day, and the vast majority of them being in the last 2 hours of daylight. 25,000 or more of them were in the last 2 hours of daylight. So amazing, amazing phenomenon, and really, truly amazing birds. But they're not hawks. It's okay. They look like hawks when they're flying, and some of their characteristics are similar, but they are not hawks at all. Some of the interesting other early birds tend to be swallows and flycatchers. A lot of the insect-eating passerines or songbirds are the earlier departure birds. This year we counted 3,113 cliff swallows on a single day, September the 3rd. The total count at this point, and probably for the season, is a little more than 4,000, and they came through in just a few days. Alder flycatchers, the furthest north breeding flycatcher species, come through in big numbers as well. I always love alder flycatchers. As a bird bander, I band a lot of these at a summer banding station up at Sugarloaf Cove on the North Shore, and it's amazing to me, these little birds that weigh about as much as a nickel or two in your pocket. They fly all the way to South America and back to the same place every year. And I've been catching birds that have been to South America and back 5, 6, 7 times. If that doesn't blow your mind, something that tiny, like I say, without GPS and without all those other things to guide it, does that every year, twice, and survives. That's amazing. So yeah, some of these incredible birds, each of them has a story. The raptors at Hawk Ridge typically come through in phases. We always say, like I say, the early birds come earlier in the season, and these are the birds that have to make it to South America or going longer distances, or they're also birds where something is changing. And the primary thing I ask kids all the time, why do birds migrate? Because it's getting cold. That's what everybody always says. And yeah, cold is a player, but the main player is actually the dietary needs of the bird. Their menu is pretty much dissipating. In the case of some of these birds that eat other birds, the other birds are leaving and going south because their insects that they predominantly survive on are disappearing in late summer, and so forth and so on. We say that if you want to see a lot of birds come to Hawk Ridge in September, there can be tens of thousands of birds seen in a single day at the ridge at that time of the year. As you go later in the season, different birds fly, and these are the birds that don't have to go quite as far, but they're still fascinating birds. Here's a kettle of broadwing hawks. I always say in the fall, thank the good Lord for bald eagles because they're huge and you can find them in a kettle. And then you use your binoculars and look beyond the bald eagles, and behind them can literally be hundreds of these broadwing hawks. They're the smallest member of the booreal family, or the soaring hawks, that include red-tailed hawks. But broadwing hawks are by far the most common bird that we see. In fact, when we're counting these birds, we see and count more of these birds than all of the other species combined typically in a year. So yeah, amazing birds. And part of the reason that they're interesting is their lifestyle patterns. What do you think you eat if you are a broad-winged hawk? Well, they're a booreal. Most of the booreals make their living catching rodents and rabbits and squirrels and things like that, but not these guys. Their preferred fare is, believe it or not, reptiles and amphibians. Oh yeah, snakes and frogs and toads and stuff. And so these birds do get an environmental cue to boogie on out of there, because yeah, their prey is starting to hibernate and become less frequently seen as the temperatures decrease. And these birds, again, from banding data, we've learned that they typically come through in about a 2-week window of time, usually the last 2 weeks of September. And it can be an amazing thing. On a big flight day, it may be 10, 12,000 of these birds coming through in a single day. Now, if you're like me, that sort of muddles your brain until you experience it. But it's absolutely phenomenal. The highest hawk count ever. Start imagining, do yourself make a guess. What would you expect might be the highest number of birds? I've just told you that regularly 10 to 12,000 is no big deal. We see that fairly frequently. Turns out that the highest number of broadwing hawks ever seen in a single day was 101,698 on a day in September in 2003. Oh my gosh. I mean, yeah, how do you even begin to count that high? But those numbers can be enormous. A lot of it depends on weather and things like that. So some years you will see phenomenal migrations of these birds. Other years, less so. Last year in particular, 2019, was not the greatest a year for broadwing hawks because we had so many southerly winds. And these booreals don't like to travel with southerly winds. So what they ended up doing for most of them was going around and not coming through. But this year we had a bigger than average year. We're about 5,000 to 6,000 birds higher than average for this year. So good year for broadwing hawks. But the lake brings in lots of other kinds of creatures as well. Yeah, here you go. It's the Pirates of the Great Lakes Superior, not the Caribbean. And in walks, I should say, not walks, flies a group of birds um, um, called Jaegers. And these Jaegers, we have three different varieties. The most common ones in the upper left-hand corner, that's a parasitic Jaeger. In the middle, there's a Pomeranian Jaeger, and down at the bottom is a long-tailed Jaeger. They're kleptoparasites. All right, well, what the heck is a kleptoparasite? Well, it turns out the kleptoparasites make their living. Yes, they are pirates. They steal food from the gulls that they travel with. So they'll hang with a group of gulls. A gull scores a meal and is flying away with it, and yep, in flies the kleptoparasite to snatch it or harass the gull to the point where it drops it, and in flies the Jaeger to pick it off. So yeah, there's a couple of weeks in time in late September into early October that the Jaegers are present around Lake Superior. There is actually a Jaeger Fest that's based in Superior on the Wisconsin side that takes advantage, but there's an interesting set. We also have 3 species of loons that turn up, and the common loons, we know about those guys. We see those in Minnesota lakes and hear them all summer long. But the other 2, the one in the middle there is a Pacific loon, and the one on the bottom is a red-throated loon. Those are birds that come down. Well, Pacific sounds like it should be coming from the west, but the truth of the matter is that both of those birds are birds that are found in Hudson Bay, and so they're just coming from Hudson Bay south, and getting a little more amenable environment at that point. Now, loons, you probably know, are fishing birds and divers, and they don't have hollow bones. And so if you're going to be a loon and you want to take off, our common loons, we know, need a big lake to be able to take off from, and they have to have a very long running start. The Pacific loon is similar in that way, but the red-throated loon is not. It turns out that unlike the Pacific loon and the common loon, if those birds ended up on land, they'd be in tough shape, and they'd have to walk to the water as quickly as they could. There'd be absolutely no way they'd be able to take off in flight from land, but the red-throated loon can. It's small enough and a little more dainty than the other 2. But these birds are frequently seen on Lake Superior in the Duluth area in the fall, and sometimes even hang through the winter. And fall is also owl banding season. In fact, we always say at Hawk Ridge that there are points in the season where there is banding going on at the ridge 24/7, and a big chunk of that is this the owl banding that's happening. And our 2 main types that we catch are saw-whet owls, which are about 6 inches tall, and yes, they really do win the world prize for cuteness. They're just tiny and just amazingly fierce little things. Their expression of I'm a big guy and watch out for me is to clack their beak. And so when you catch one of those and putting on the tough guy act, it'll clack its beaks, and it's just amazing. We band more saw-whet owls than any other station in the country, and average right around 1,200 a year. We've seen as high as 1,800 in 2012. Another mainframe in the owl banding too is the long-eared owls, and a lot of those come through. We ban a lot fewer of those, but we do catch a fair number about 90 per year on average, but more in good years. This year has been a particularly good year for long-eared owls and a variety of other owls. In fact, this year they actually caught a great gray owl during the owl banding season, which typically goes from the 15th of September through about the first week and a half of November. Saw-whet owls are birds that are banded and captured in a wide range of locations across the country, and it's great fun to band these birds and get records of them being recaptured in other locations. For example, they're banded at Wolf Ridge Environmental Learning Center in Finland, Minnesota, just a little to the north of us in Duluth, and it's regular for us to catch birds that were banded there and vice versa. We don't know a lot about the migratory movements of these birds. We just know that they do. Some of the things that we found out is that the females seem to be more likely to migrate than the males. Some of the males may actually stay and overwinter in an area, whereas the females may continue on. And if you look at the map of recoveries there, these are all birds that were banded at Hawk Ridge, released, and then recovered elsewhere. You'll see that they tend to stay in fairly tight range there, but a lot of their movement seems to be to the south and to the east. But we also know that we get birds that have come or gone to Alberta and even on into points in British Columbia. So there's a lot of stuff we're still trying to figure out about a lot of these birds, and banding helps give us tools to do that. As we move later in the fall, I would say October belongs to the big guys. These are the big birds of prey, and most of these don't really need to migrate south too far. A lot of them could winter where they are because their prey is fairly flexible, but choose not to. And so they do come south, but they generally don't go very far south. They're regional migrators that may only go a little ways south. The golden eagle, that's the upper left hand. The rough-legged hawk, which is kind of the center one, this year has been a phenomenal rough-legged hawk migration year. We have counted as of yesterday, 1,851 of those birds for this season. The previous season high total was set in 2017 and was a little more than 1,100 birds. So we are more than 730 birds to the good on rough-legged hawks this year. Whoa, that's a huge year. And we actually set a new daily count record on a day in October at 583 of these counted in a single day. We'll hear more about red-tailed hawks and bald eagles a little bit later. Going to save that for a little bit later in the program. But let's go back to the golden eagle. November the 12th, 2012, we captured the first ever golden eagle at the main banding station at Hawk Ridge. And interestingly enough, at that time, Mark Martell from Minnesota Audubon had a major grant to reach out to anybody that was trapping birds to be part of their study. And what they were doing is studying the wintering grounds of these birds. And so we were able to fit this bird with a satellite transmitter. So the golden eagle that was caught was a male. It was named Jack in honor of Jack Pershing, the founder of Hawk Ridge, and was banded and fitted with this transmitter that you can see in the picture up on the upper left-hand corner. That bird was then released, and we were waiting with bated breath to follow what would happen and where that bird would go, presuming that it would continue to go south, and it certainly did. It traveled south, and we found that that bird liked to hang out on the in the area in the Missouri-Arkansas border, in the Ozarks, and it consistently traveled to that location. We were able to track it completely for 2 complete migrations before the transmitters stopped working in 2014. I was just looking at stuff with this the other day and adding this in. 2014, that season, it left the Ozarks on the 15th of March and was back in its breeding grounds. And if you look at the map in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that that bird traveled way up to northern Canada, in fact, north of Great Slave Lake, and bred there consistently for a number of years. It traveled 2,482 miles in about 28 days, or averaging about 88 miles per day. That's a pretty respectable migration. Now, I'm guessing that some days were more and some days less, but that's a significant thing. We also learned from this study that the birds are loyal to their breeding grounds, but they're also equally loyal to their wintering grounds, which is something that we didn't understand or know much prior to that. So yeah, the signal was lost later on after the arrival back in 2017 in the breeding ground, and the bird was not heard from again until May the 24th this year. The bird was recovered, its body was recovered 15 miles northeast of Saskatoon in Saskatchewan. It was clearly on its way back to its breeding ground, and we don't know entirely what happened to that bird, and are seeking further information from the person who found it if we can get a cause of death. By the way, in the map on the in the lower part of the screen there, those are 2 other birds. Jack is the red one, and that was its spring migration at one point in that season. So yeah, fascinating stuff. And as we move on into winter, a lot of the birds that hang out in the winter time on Lake Superior and in the Duluth Harbor area are coming to a warmer place. Duluth and the southern end of Lake Superior is a warmer place for some of these Arctic birds. Here on this slide are 4 species of Arctic gulls that come down: the great blackback in the upper left corner, the Iceland gull, the glaucous gull, and sometimes the lesser blackback. All can be found on normal years in the harbor area in Duluth. In fact, if you hang out at the Maritime Museum in the wintertime, seeing gulls perched on the barrier on the canal coming in underneath the lift bridge into the harbor is a great place to look for gulls, at least when the water is open, and you can spend hours trying to sort your way through. Oh, well, that's a young bird. And gulls, by the way, most of these take 4 years to get to their full adult plumage. So you'll see kind of brownish ones that are first-year birds, and then brown with a little bit of gray, and then brown with a little more gray, and so forth. You can become quite the connoisseur of gulls hanging out down there at the Maritime Museum in the wintertime. It's a great place to go check out these birds. So yeah, if you haven't done it, try it. It's great fun. Winter in the harbor and the open lake can be just ducky. Lots of different species of ducks will hang. The common goldeneye is a real frequent one, and usually the mergansers will stay. And we definitely have a huge flock of mallards that move back and forth between the open lake and the harbor. But we also pick up some other ones further north, some Arctic Riviera types, the long-tailed duck and the common eider and the harlequin duck can frequently be found in the harbor area in the wintertime or on the lake. And those Canada geese, yep, they'll hang out and stand around on the ice for you in the wintertime. So nice to see. Here's one of my favorites that comes down and hangs out in the wintertime. We occasionally have gyrfalcons, which is the largest member of the falcon family. And this particular falcon, the gyrfalcon that I'm going to talk about, was originally banded, caught and banded. They like to hang out by the grain elevators in the harbor. And the reason for that is because hanging out at the grain elevators are also lots and lots of pigeons. So yeah, there's lots of food hanging out by the harbor there and in those grain elevators. And so the gyrfalcons will come down from the tundra and hang out periodically in the wintertime. And in 2003, one of those birds was captured with a trap at one of the grain elevators. And I happened to have a friend who was working with the bander who grabbed me and said, "We're going." And we went to watch the gyrfalcon get banded. And I actually have a picture somewhere in the dim recesses of my files. Who knows where that is? I couldn't find it for you. But of me holding that bird, and it was released in 2003. And in the world of banding, you sometimes think that they'll never be seen or heard from again because the proportion that are is fairly small, but they give us incredibly valuable information. In this particular case, the same bird came back in both 2015 and 2016 and was recaptured. It now holds the record for the longest lived banded gyrfalcon in the wild. It was recaptured 15 years and 9 months from the original date of banding in 2003. So yeah, is that a cool story or what? We also get a lot of winter owls. I mentioned great grays earlier and that we'd already caught one at the banding station, which is incredibly rare. Ordinarily, if we want to band owls, we need to get out and about in the wintertime. But I want you to take a look at that picture of me holding that great gray owl. That was the first great gray owl I ever had in my hands, and I was thrilled, I gotta tell you. But they're huge. Just check that out. You can see that its tail is level with my waist, and it's going all the way up to the top of my head there, a good 18 inches, closer to 20 to 22. That's huge. They are the largest owl of North America, but they're not the heaviest. There's actually two species of owls that are heavier. Great horned and snowy owls are both much heavier than the great grays. Great grays are really just huge balls of fluff. When you hold them in your hand, you can get a little bit of that impression because yeah, there's just lots and lots of feathers, and those breast feathers on that bird are every bit of 8 to 12 inches long. That just blows your mind. The bird in the middle is a northern hawk owl, and we are just getting ready to take off on a graduate student study on northern hawk owls, and they are really amazing birds, but we only get them some of the time. You can usually always find them in Sax-Zim in the wintertime, but not everywhere else. So interesting sort of stuff. They're very nomadic birds, and the grad student that wants to study them is a student actually who's worked with us at Hawk Ridge for a number of years now, Hannah Tatangi, who took advantage of all three of our traineeship positions. She came first as an education trainee, then came back as account trainee, and then as a banding trainee. So she's trained in all three areas of specialty at Hawk Ridge, and is now back as a grad student to study these birds. And her main focus is on foraging ecology and bioenergetics or energetics, and some DNA work as well. They're getting a fancy new piece of equipment coming in to measure metabolic rates for birds. So interesting stuff. Lots of research going on with all of these birds. The bird in the lower right-hand corner is a snowy owl. That was the first caught at the main banding station at Hawk Ridge in November. Winter and finches. Some years are good and some years are not. 2019 was terrible for finches. These are all birds that breed in the boreal forest and points further north. Some years they'll come south, some of them. Some years they'll come north, all of them. And some years not at all. Like I say, last year was a not at all. You couldn't find a common red hole to save your soul last winter in northern Minnesota. It just wasn't possible. But I've got news for you. 2020 is the reverse of all of that. We actually have all of these finch species migrating through in big numbers this fall, and there have been reports of evening grosbeaks, the upper left-hand bird, occurring already points south almost to the Twin Cities. Pine grosbeaks are all over the place, and that's the bird in the upper right-hand corner. And then the crossbills, both the white-billed or white-winged and red crossbills have been coming through in big numbers. You can take a look at some of the numbers for the season thus far. So pretty amazing. And the crossbills are just really super, super, super cool birds. They actually do have crossed bills, and those crossed bills make them ideally suited to take apart the pine cones by flipping the individual petals, if you want to call them, of the pine cone apart to get at the seeds inside. So they're really, really, really well equipped for that job. So yeah, winter, that's just a slice of the winter world, but we do have counting, and I love spring counting because spring counting gives me hope. I'm a person where winter starts to feel long about the middle of March. And I love the fact that I can go out in the spring and see birds that are actually migrating to their nesting territory in March when there's still snow everywhere. And yes, it really is cold. These are slides from 2019. There was still a lot of snow, but these birds are taking off and heading north to those places in, for us, what feels like still the middle of the winter. So yeah, pretty amazing that they're already on their way north. I always say the bald eagles and the chickadees give me faith that it's going to get better and it's going to melt, and chickadees start doing their breeding calls or songs in sunny days in January. I always say they sound like they're saying, "Hey, sweetie." Yeah, so they get going any great sunny day in that early winter that says they're starting to think about breeding and setting up territories. Hooray. And other birds are not far behind them. The bald eagles are some of the early ones, and we'll talk about them in a second. Some of our raptors will stay and winter here. This is a series of pictures taken by John Richardson, our count director. He's a great photographer, and he's always getting pictures. And this is a picture of a merlin taking on a pigeon and winning. You can see that size-wise, these birds are comparable. In fact, the pigeon may be a hair bigger than the merlin, but the merlin definitely won the battle and got the pigeon and consumed it. Merlins are a bird, and we have done a major study that I want to tell you a little bit about. We've been studying mercury accumulation in birds. We've learned over the years that mercury is a fairly persistent environmental toxin. It's pretty much everywhere. You can test just about anything and come up with mercury. And mercury is a neurotoxin. In fact, you've ever heard the story about the Mad Hatter. The Mad Hatters were furriers that were working on curing beaver pelts to make the infamous beaver felt hats of the 1800s, 17 and 1800s. And they were called Mad Hatters because they used a mercury compound to skim the guard hairs off of those pelts for the softer fur underneath, which is what they used to make the felt, to make the beaver felt hats. And they got crazy over time using all of that mercury. And so hatters were known to be a little bit nuts because of that neurotoxin. Move forward. Yeah.
I'm just gonna interrupt quickly. You're at about 50 minutes.
Excellent, thank you. I told Sarah to help me keep track of time because I can get down the bird rabbit hole real fast, in case you can't tell. Anyhow, back to modern day, and we're doing a study. I have been doing a study. A graduate student started a study that had us collecting feather samples from birds captured at the raptor banding station and testing them for the levels of mercury. And what they found in testing the birds is that having tested a wide variety of birds, 14 different species of raptors, they found that the mercury content was highest in the raptors that typically eat other birds, rather than the raptors that eat, say, mammals as their main fare. So this merlin and the sharp-shinned hawk are birds that were found to have the highest levels of mercury in their feathers. And so we have been working with that and started the second half of the study now, taking samples of their prey a little further down the line in the passerines and finding out more about that. And finding that some passerine species we just got our first set of data on that last spring, and found that those birds were the birds that were most likely to have high levels were birds that hang around aquatic environments quite a lot more. And the highest levels were found in the northern water thrush. Interesting. So we're continuing to work on that whole mercury study and expanding and fine-tuning as we go. So keep your ears peeled for more information on mercury. Here's some winter residents heading out. These are Bohemian waxwings, and definitely birds that we regularly see during the spring count at Hawk Ridge. By the way, the spring count doesn't happen at Hawk Ridge, the same place. It happens on the west skyline instead of the east skyline. The main reason for that is that the birds that are coming from the south in the wintertime are not being funneled by Lake Superior, because Lake Superior is what they're hitting after they pass through Duluth. So we don't see the volume of birds that we see in the fall, but we do see some different trends. And we have just started a grant. Spring counting has been fairly inconsistent up until recent times, and we've got a donation to fund 10 years of spring counting, and spring counting isn't done in very many places. So this is a whole fascinating new range of information that we're learning from spring migration numbers. And this slide shows you some of my favorite spring migrants. Upper left hand are tundra swans, and tundra swans and trumpeter swans both come through in the spring, and they're really, really, really hard to tell apart, even flying through with experts on the other end. So it's behavioral things sometimes that help us. And in the case of tundra swans usually always travel in large groups, whereas trumpeter swans typically do not. Trumpeter swans usually travel in pairs or even four, but typically no more than that. So if you see more than 4 to 6 birds together, you can probably call them tundra swans. Osprey in the bottom left hand there, we see a lot of them in the spring, not quite as many as the fall, but osprey are interesting in that you can know when you see them coming through in the spring that it's the adults, because the young birds tend to stay south. More banding data that has told us this. They stay south until they're actually old enough to breed. So the birds that come through in the spring, we can safely say are adults, because the young birds stay south. The bird in the center there is a northern harrier, and that's another interesting research story. One of our research committee members has done a study on data of northern harriers in a variety of Midwest and Eastern counting scenarios, and found that these birds, their numbers do fall into an approximate 4-year cycle. They tend to have a little 4-year peak going on. We're not entirely sure what that's related to yet, but it clearly is exhibited in the stations in the central flyway. The eastern coastline stuff doesn't work quite as well. But one of the hypotheses, and this is definitely something for further study, but one of the hypotheses is that these harriers are tied to another 4-year cycle of the Hudson Bay lowland voles, the meadow voles that they predominantly feed on. But more research necessary. And speaking of more research, another of our grad students has been doing studies on migrating birds and what they're eating. And the way of figuring that out, her hypothesis was to take swabs of the cloaca. Yep, that's the outbound poop line. And if you take swabs of that, you can analyze the DNA and compare the DNA results with a database of prey DNA and figure out an idea of what they're eating. Interestingly enough, the fecal swabs of the northern harrier did confirm that, yes, indeed, they are eating voles. So there you go. Voles are confirmed parts of these Midwestern birds' diet. A couple of other interesting things found in that fecal study. Sharp-shin hawks, and you'll see some sharp-shin hawks shortly in a picture here. We've banded some and done feather pulls in the spring. We do some banding in the spring, though not as much as in the fall. And these sharp-shin hawks, which if you hold your fist in front of your hand, that's about the body size of a female. The interesting DNA results from the study showed that sharp-shin hawks were arriving in the spring with turkey DNA. Okay, wild turkey DNA in a sharp-shin hawk. There's a really huge size differential there. And so the hypothesis is perhaps these birds are taking much more advantage of carrion and roadkill type things than we've previously thought. They're not actually all doing live prey. They're taking opportunity. So further research going to be happening with that. The other actual interesting compound was a northern goshawk that had porcupine DNA in their fecal swabs. And again, the hypothesis is, yeah, northern goshawk's not going to take on a porcupine to kill it, but it might take advantage of a roadkill or a dead porcupine found in the area. So lots of interesting stuff going on. We are starting a red-tailed hawk study with more satellite stuff because we catch red-tailed hawks that are dark morph. And theoretically, dark morph means they're darker underneath and they look different. Red-tailed hawks have many, many, many color variations depending on where you are. Western birds and eastern birds and harlans and criters and all kinds of stuff. And you can look in your bird guide and you can see lots of options. But one of the things that's not supposed to be happening is there's not supposed to be dark morph red-tailed hawks in the eastern population, which is what we are in, is mainly the eastern population of red-tailed hawks. But, you know, when you persistently catch dark morph red-tailed hawks at Hawk Ridge, you got to start asking what the question is, where are these birds coming from? And so this new study is to use satellite tracking on these birds to see where they're going, and also do some DNA work and find out if these birds are more closely related to Western birds that have come to the east and stayed, or are they more closely related to the eastern birds? So stay tuned, more interesting work to come. Bald eagles. When does spring migration start? Well, I mentioned earlier that the bald eagles are, for me, the ones that really started out. Our spring count starts on the March the 1st, and we actually see more bald eagles in the spring than we do in the fall. Pretty amazing. And 2019 was a new record spring count for us. 7,727 were counted in 2019. And we had a day on March the 24th. That's the wrong date that's on there on the slide. It says March the 3rd. It's actually March the 21st or 22nd. Anyway, we counted 1,076 bald eagles in a single day. Just imagine you're out on the spring count, and I was there that day, and imagine looking off to one area and seeing a kettle of bald eagles, and then moving a little further over and there's another kettle. And at any given moment on that day, you could scan the skies and literally see 100 bald eagles at a time flying through. Phenomenal stuff. This year was not as great for bald eagles, and it's not because there are less bald eagles, it's just the weather was bad migration weather, and so birds tended to go around and take a different route. All kinds of fascinating stuff. We also see more turkey vultures in the spring. You can see fall counts versus spring counts. We see more, not quite twice as many more, but quite a lot. I always love the turkey vultures. They are the epitome of efficient flight. Just watch these guys, and it's great fun to watch them and the bald eagles together in the spring. Turkey vultures will outfly the bald eagles every time. It's amazing. They're about the same size, bird-wise, but the turkey vultures have an advantage over the bald eagles. And I've seen them on days where it looks like the turkey vultures are saying, nah, 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 you can't do this, because they're soaring like crazy, and the bald eagles are having to pump like crazy to even be able to maintain their height in the sky. What's the difference? Well, it turns out that even though they're comparable size birds, weight-wise, the bald eagles weigh almost twice as much as the turkey vultures. And so bald eagles have to work much, much harder to fly and soar than the turkey vultures do. But that said, I think those bald eagles will power through just about anything. You can be out on the worst flight date ever, fall or spring, and if anybody's going to be flying, it's going to be those bald eagles. I think they're just so big, they just power through it. There's a sharp-shinned hawk, and just to give you a size perspective, there's Lula, one of our regular visitors, and she's holding a sharp-shinned hawk, and you can see it's not a very large bird, but they were being found, like I say, with wild turkey in their in their fecal matter. So curious things going on in the world of birds. In this picture, you can see it's actually two pictures. It looks like just one, but that's a little illusion of two slides or two pictures. The upper one's an adult, and the bottom one is a juvenile bird. So there's a little difference there. This is a northern goshawk, an adult on the right side and a juvenile on the left side. They're in the same families as sharp-shinned hawks, but this is the bigger bird, and this is a bird with a huge importance here at Hawk Ridge. This is another one of those birds that we see more in counting and band more than any other location in North America for sure, if not the world. And so fascinating birds. And they are actually going through a huge steady decline in their population numbers. We were talking about harriers having a 4-year cycle. For years, it was observed that the northern goshawks had periodic high points in their migration about every 8 to 10 years. And you can see that on this graph showing data from Hawk Ridge from the early 80s of 3,535 counted in about 1983. And then the population falling down, and then another high count, but not nearly as high in the early 90s, followed by another one in the early 2000s. We've been waiting for another peak year, but you can see that the population is steadily declining. And in this particular graph, it indicates in the mid maybe 2014 or so, we saw 269. Actually, the current average is a little over 200 by 2020 now. So we're concerned about northern goshawks and not seeing those cyclic highs and don't really know why. We've been expecting another high for close to 15 years now, and it hasn't happened. It may be that the population is too small for that kind of a peak. It may be other things, but it's definitely an area of research that raptor biologists are studying, trying to get the answer to. Lots of other spring favorites, sandhill cranes and peregrine falcons, and my all-time favorite, pelicans. You can tell it's spring because they've got notches sticking up on the top of those huge bills. That's a breeding feature only during breeding season. The birds on the upper left are at Chambers Grove Park. That's a great place to check out in the spring. But they're flying over and they're a big part of the flight that we see in the spring. And yes, as we're moving closer to summer, some of the last birds to arrive will be the warblers. You can test yourself out on Warbler Savvy and see how many of those species you can guess. I'm not going to go through all of those, but yeah, the northern part of Minnesota is warbler central. And as we move on into summer, These are the birds that, if you're a warbler person, this is the place to come, and you will see more species of warblers. I've banded 25 different species of warblers during the summertime here in northern Minnesota. You can't do that very many places. So interesting stuff. And as the spring migration ends, these guys kind of are the tag colorful end to that migration. So yeah, we tend to know who our summer residents are, and this program's mostly about migratory stuff, so I'm not gonna get into summer residents as much here. But I couldn't finish this slide presentation without mentioning education. I am, after all, the education director. We do a lot of bird demonstrations at Hawk Ridge. This year we still did bird demonstrations, but we did not do our usual of letting an audience member return the bird to the wild. Unfortunately, the COVID has kept us at a minimum, but we were still able to do bird demonstrations, and we do lots and lots of education beginning September 1st through October 31st, and even through the rest of the year. We're now doing education things with a spring count. Yeah, typically in a year we average about 500 programs for more than 12,000 participants. So lots of education happens, and I'm enjoying doing this with you all virtually. At our fall location, we typically expect about 18,000 visitors every fall. And yeah, just know that education is very much a part of the story, as well as the counting and the banding and all the other things. And with that, I hope that I have convinced you that there's a lot of stuff going on in migration and a lot of fascinating stories. There's a lot going on with Hawk Ridge Bird Observatory, and if you haven't visited us, we would love to have you do that. Check out online resources. There's an awful lot of good stuff on our website, and know that we're always looking for volunteers and members to support our efforts as a nonprofit. We don't get any state or federal money for running our operations, so it all comes from grants and memberships and donations and visitors like yourselves. So keep your eyes on the skies in Duluth or wherever you might be. Thanks, y'all, for coming, and I am more than happy to turn it back over to Sarah, and I'll be happy to take some questions if you have them.
Well, thank you, Margie. That was awesome. That was really interesting, and it was a very nice, different perspective on what else we can see at Lake Superior and the Ship Canal besides boats. Not that we don't love our boats, but you know, it's nice to see what else Lake Superior gets used for. Before we get into the questions, I just wanted to go through a couple of things for our visitors. I just wanted to give a quick update on our visitor center status. We went through this earlier, but just for those who may have missed it, the Lake Superior Maritime Visitor Center in Duluth is still currently closed. We do have staff there making vessel announcements and arrivals and departures, and we're available for phone calls if visitors want to get any America the Beautiful passes or things like that. We do have a cell phone tour available that can be accessed outdoors, and also a virtual online tour of the museum. And that information is posted on our doors as well if you end up trying to visit us down there. And pretty soon the gift shop at the visitor center will be online. Hopefully in the next week or so there you should be having an online presence so you can buy things from the gift shop. And at the Soo Locks Visitor Center in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, their visitor center closed in October, as it does every year, but their park remains open from 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. And both of our visitor centers will reopen when we can comply with state and federal guidance and when local health conditions permit. And then here's another page of just some resources for you our next program will be on December 3rd in 2 weeks. It's going to be Ranger Steve from the Visitor Center. Will be talking about Great Lakes navigation and how that developed and what the tools were and what we use today. And then we also have on the right side our websites, the Detroit District website, as well as our supporting association, the Lake Superior Maritime or Marine Museum Association, lsmma.com. There's also a website for Hawk Ridge if you want to learn more about what they're doing up there. And then the Facebook pages are also our supporting organizations and the Detroit District. And then I mentioned in the beginning that this program was recorded, and so all the recordings are going to be able to be found on the Detroit District's YouTube channel. So if you just search that, that should pop right up. Our vessel schedules for the Twin Ports, there's a hotline you can call, and also harborlookout.com is our website. And then if you're interested in joining our program mailing list to get information about our upcoming programs, please send an email to hello@lsmvc@gmail.com. And then there's also a short survey, a couple-minute survey that you can take that will help us to improve our programs. If you have a couple minutes to take that, that would be appreciated. And now we can move on to questions. I lost my mouse. Give me a second.
Oh no. Okay. Well, I can see on the chat we had a question from somebody about asking me, and this is the classic question that I get about 600 times every year. Of all your bird encounters, can you tell us about your favorite experience? That's like, there's so many, and they all stand out for their own reasons. I typically respond and say, whichever bird is in my hand at the time, that's my favorite at the moment. But I do admit to having a soft spot for warblers. So there you go. Not a very good answer, but it's so hard. Holy cow.
I was curious, Margie, about how you got started in the career. What made you want to study birds?
Well, I always knew when I was a kid that it was outdoor things that drew me. I really got into being a bird nerd later on in my life. I had interest because I had interest in everything birds, but I did a number of things, actually even post-college, that really cemented that for me. One of the things was to take coursework at Shoals Marine Lab on an island in the Gulf of Maine, and every August during summer programming, they had a bander who came out, and if I'd have been a class skipper, would have been skipping classes like crazy to spend time with the bander. And I did. I skipped everything that was non-essential and spent all this time with this bander. And I said, I have to learn how to do this and have to do this when I go home. So I did. I made it happen. And that sort of was kind of one of the beginnings of the bird nerd thing. But yeah, lots and lots and lots of things contributed. But that naturalist, that inner naturalist, just really needed to know more about the birds. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
You mentioned that next year is the 50th anniversary, or the 50th anniversary of Hawk Ridge, or the 50th year that you've been open. Are you planning on doing anything special for that?
I'm sure that we are, and I was just thinking about that the other day, going, I think we probably should start planning that now. What do you think? So yeah, with all this COVID stuff, maybe we'll actually have time to do some significant planning, but I'm sure that there will be big things associated with it. Especially, we typically have a hawk weekend in September that didn't happen this year, but we typically time it with that peak broadwing hawk thing. So I'm sure there'll be some very special things associated with the hawk weekend this coming year in 2021, in commemoration of the 50th anniversary of fall and counting and banding at Hawk Ridge. So stay alert to further posts with more information.
Okay. Yeah, one thing I noticed when I first moved here, I used to drive from Duluth to Two Harbors on 61, and the amount of birds that you would encounter on the North Shore Drive like that was just incredible to me. I didn't realize how important the area was for bird migration. So it's just something that I've never seen before. So that's one of the really cool things about Duluth is that I think the migration.
Absolutely. Migration Central.
Mm-hmm.
We're it. So yeah. Yeah, and the interesting thing is you don't have to be any place special in Duluth. In Duluth, you can look up in the sky anywhere and see birds, and
Mm-hmm.
that's way cool.
Yeah.
So,
Another question about do you have a lot of volunteer opportunities during regular time, non-COVID times?
yeah, we do. We look for volunteers to help us out with everything from office mailings to working at the Overlook with us and helping manage visitors and handling questions and toting birds back and forth from the banding station to the Overlook so that we can do demonstrations to working with us in the banding station. We definitely need well-trained and well-committed volunteers to help out with banding as well. So lots and lots of opportunities. And there's information online on how to get in contact with us about that. So if you're interested in volunteering, we would love to have you.
Great. All right. So if anyone has any further questions, please use that chat function. We can stay on for a few more minutes and see if we get any more questions. Otherwise, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today on our virtual visitor center session.
Alrighty. Thanks everybody for letting me fill your head with birds.
You mentioned you went to Costa Rica. What did you do when you were there?
It was a quick visit. I had been fascinated. I actually got the opportunity to go with a friend of mine who was doing some professional stuff and just kind of tagged on along with that. And I've always wondered about the tropical rainforest and the diversity, and it was just fascinating to be able to actually see that for myself and be in a place that had more than, I said Minnesota has 444 birds. The area that I was in Costa Rica had more than 700 birds living in a very, very small area. So diversity, just phenomenal. So yeah, but it was very interesting. One of the things that I found out about some of the birds that I most wanted to see, I really, really, really wanted to see scarlet macaws, and I saw lots of them, and I really wanted to see toucans, and I was participating with an ornithologist at the reserve we were visiting, and we went out on point counts in the morning to try and listen to all kinds of different sorts of birds, and I was actually cursing the loudness of the macaws and the toucans by the time I was done because I couldn't hear the other birds over the toucans and the macaws. What a problem to have.
Interesting. I had another quick question I thought of. What is the farthest or the species that would have been like farthest away that you've ever seen in Duluth?
Oh, there's been a couple. We always, every fall, get a couple of vagrant species. Red-shouldered hawks are bootios that are ranges further south and east of us. We had a lovely experience this fall we actually had two red-shouldered hawks come through this year, but one of them, they called at the banding station, called at the count platform back to the banding station. The banding station was able to lure it in. They caught it and then eventually sent it up to us at the Overlook, and I was able to show off the red-shouldered hawk to everybody and return it to the wild. So that was really, really fun. we see a few of those kinds of birds. But yeah, lots of other chance encounters can happen. We had a calliope hummingbird that was hanging out on Park Point a number of years ago. Those will turn up. I mean, just really strange stuff. We counted a prairie warbler on a birdathon count in May one year. So yeah, you just never quite know. Birds can do that. They can just wander, and some are more likely to wander than others. So it pays to keep your eyes on the birds, and it also pays to have a good idea of who's normal in your area and who's not. So fun stuff.
Mhm. Great. Well, thanks again, Margie, for sharing a little bit about what you do with us. And I don't see any other questions, so we can end this until next time. Once again, December 3rd, we're having a program about discovering navigation within the Great Lakes. Ranger Steve will be talking about the history of navigation and how it applies to vessels on the Great Lakes. That's Thursday, December 3rd at 11:30 Central or 12:30 Eastern. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you all learned something, and hopefully we will see you on December 3rd. Stay safe, everyone. And thanks again,
Everybody,
Margie.
bye-bye.
Bye.